We have word that the ranking member is on his way, so with a little bit more indulgence, as soon as he gets here, we'll gavel in and get going. Thank you for your patience. The Subcommittee on Government Operations will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I want to start out by saying good morning and welcome, and thanking my colleagues. This is one of those days where, when the schedule was changed, obviously, Mr. Wahlberg, who is the vice chair of this subcommittee, and Mr. Conley, who is the ranking member of this subcommittee, adjusted their schedules to remain here. And so on behalf of myself and all those that I represent, I want to acknowledge that, and I thank you. I also want to make a welcome to all those that not only have traveled so far and are here today to testify and come and be here on this important issue, but those on a webcast. That we probably had more calls about how to view this particular hearing than others that would maybe make the headlines of the Washington Post. So it is refreshing to see that so many people are wanting to get involved. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA as it's known, is a federal corporate agency of the United States, and in May of this year, the board of directors of TVA actually proposed a policy to prohibit all new floating homes on the 49 reservoirs in the 7 southeastern states. This proposed policy also required the removal of all floating homes after a 30-year sunset provision. For the hard-working homeowners in the TVA's jurisdiction of Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky, this proposed policy would be devastating. Now, I've said this before, and I will say it again, this is yet another example of the federal government getting involved without seriously evaluating the consequences placed on tax-paying families. And as we will hear in testimony today, those impacted, some of whom have lived on these reservoirs for generations, feel genuinely outraged and misled. For example, many were promised in 1978 when TVA put forth a rule that it would subsequently really never enforce for nearly 40 years, that existing houseboats would be grandfathered in. And yet here we are today. Those that are owners of the grandfathered houseboats are being told to start packing their bags. What's more, the number of floating homes that have increased over the decades, and the homeowners in the Tennessee Valley have invested tens of thousands and indeed tens of millions of dollars into new or existing floating homes. You know, in my home state of North Carolina, hundreds of families will be forced to move from their homes, many of whom who have enjoyed those and lived there for years and years and years, if not decades. This policy would be also detrimental financially to the impact on the region and will become nearly impossible for those families, now that we have this sunset provision, to sell their floating homes. When you look at it, not to mention the fact that it will dampen the thriving houseboat tourism communities that are in many of some of the most difficult, economically challenged areas in the Southeast. Today, we will also hear whether or not those purported improvements, the removal of the houseboats, will have on the environment. And is that accurate? And is this an infringement that's worth taking on to invade the personal liberties and freedoms to live where one chooses? Instead of focusing on this policy, the TVA, in my opinion, should focus its energies on its critical priorities. I don't know that I've ever been more clear in my position to leadership of an agency or sub-agency, or in this case, a federal corporation, in terms of my disapproval of a particular decision than this. For example, providing electricity for businesses and customers and the local power distributors of some 9 million people in the Southeast, instead of displacing the homeowners, perhaps TVA should focus on its current efforts to sell a nuclear plant, which by some public accounts is being sold for $36 million after investing $5 billion. $5 billion, and you're going to sell it for $36 million. Or perhaps you need to look at continuing to work on the cleanup of the Kingston plant coal ash dump that actually contaminated drinking water of over 1 million people. So I guess my concern here today is, what is the priority? Is the priority affecting the property rights of so many people that are here and watching? Or is it what TVA was originally designed for, and that was to produce energy and to do flood control? So I'm anxious to hear some of the testimony today. I look forward to what I would say a robust discussion as we look to hopefully resolve this particular issue. And again, I thank the witnesses for their participation, and I'll recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your concern about this very discrete issue. And for the on the subject of the removal of all non-navigable houseboats and floating houses from the reservoirs within the jurisdiction of the TVA 30 years from now. Most are familiar with the TVA, which, by the way, was a great success story of government investment in an underperforming region during very difficult economic times, and by and large, a great success story about what the power of government to do good and to stimulate economic activity and create jobs and rescue a region that otherwise would have been left behind. And I think it's important in an era where all too often we hear rhetoric about the hobnail boot of government in our necks and government can't do anything right. That's not true. And it's not true in a very important part of the country, part of which encompasses my state of Virginia. TVA is now a self-funded agency supplying 9 million Americans and businesses with low-cost electricity across 7 southeastern states. The agency has a long history of supporting the economic development and prosperity of residents and businesses in Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. Areas where, at least if I had my chance, I'd be reminding people about the good government can actually do. Let's not get too carried away with that smaller government thing, because that's not how your region advanced. And it attracts $7.8 billion of direct investment alone last year. I think that's a pretty important and impressive track record. Today's hearing on floating houses highlights a lesser-known responsibility of the TVA. In 1933, when Congress created the agency, it provided TVA with broad jurisdiction to regulate obstructions that affect navigation, flood control, or public lands across, along, or in the Tennessee River or any of its tributaries. Privately owned non-navigable houseboats and floating houses have been located on agency reservoirs since at least the 1950s. And despite a ban on new construction since the 1970s, these structures have proliferated, numbering over 1,800, with only half of them holding a permit, according to TVA. Now, many have asked why TVA has not enforced its own prohibition for nearly 40 years, but, Mr. Chairman, I'm encouraged that since his appointment in 2012, Mr. Johnson, TVA's CEO, has acknowledged the problem and has now moved to try to address what he perceives as the problem. The new rule would impose an eventual ban on existing non-navigable houseboats and floating homes in 30 years. It would also require new environmental and safety standards until that time. I guess I would propound two principles from my perspective. One is that the status quo is unacceptable. There are inherent safety problems, inherent pollution problems. You know, people, we have to strike a balance, but that's the second point, we have to strike a balance. There are people who live and are where they are, and we've got to take that into account, and we've got to be sensitive, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, to their plight, their condition, their assumption that they were grandfathered in. And on the other hand, we also have a broader responsibility to the public that, you know, you don't get an ear infection when you go in the lake or the river because of uncontrolled waste coming from these structures. You don't put yourself at risk of electrical shock because we're not being as careful as we could be about how wiring is connected to these structures. So, we have a genuine challenge, but I think we have to proceed in a balanced way, and I think certainly the chairman has done, I think, an eloquent job of advocating for those who will be affected directly. And that's not a trivial matter. And so I look forward to this hearing, Mr. Chairman, especially to hear from the TVA about how are they approaching that balance. How are we making sure that we are caring for all of our citizens, including those who will be directly affected sometime over the next 30 years by this rule, and the challenges you face in trying to implement that. So I'm glad we're having a hearing that tries to do both. Look at the rule as objectively as we can, but also advocate on behalf of our constituents who certainly will be affected, some of them very adversely by this rule when and if it goes into effect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing.
I thank the gentleman, and I will make an open invitation that the next hearing will actually be a site hearing on one of these beautiful reservoirs. How about that? We'll look at that. So I'd like to hold the record open. We'll hold it open for 5 legislative days for any member who would like to submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. William Johnson, the President and CEO of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Welcome, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Laura Sneed, founder of the Fontana Families for Floating Houses. Ms. Sneed, welcome. Mr. David Monteith, the Vice Chairman of the Swain County Board of Commissioners. Welcome, Commissioner. Mr. Michael Wilkes, President of the Tennessee Valley Floating Home Alliance. Welcome, Mr. Wilkes. And Mr. Michael Butler, Chief Executive Officer of the Tennessee Wildlife Federation. Welcome, Mr. Butler. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so if you would please rise and raise your right hand. You can tell a lot about an individual by his phone ring. So, I know it wasn't. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? All right, let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. We thank you. In order to allow time for discussion, I would ask that you try to please limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will be made part of the record. So, Mr. Johnson, we'll recognize you for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Conley, members of the committee, good morning. I'm Bill Johnson, the President and CEO of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to talk about this policy. I've been in TVA about 4 years. Prior to that, I was in the utility business for many decades in North Carolina, and I have a great fondness for that state and the people who live there. Still consider myself a Tar Heel. You know, TVA is a unique organization in many respects. It's like a traditional investor-owned utility, but it has some differentiating responsibilities. Our statutory mission has 3 priorities. The first is to deliver affordable, reliable power, to create sustainable economic growth, and then to steward our region's natural and cultural resources. And over the last 83 years, we've had a number of legacy issues that we've had to deal with, and the TVA board is starting to deal with those issues. The issue of floating homes didn't develop overnight. It can't be fixed overnight. But TVA and the TVA board have a responsibility to deal with issues like this. So a little bit about TVA. We provide electricity to more than 9 million people in 7 states, including the chair and the ranking member's home states. We receive no taxpayer funding, but we do make tax equivalent payments, and last year we provided about $1.5 million in equivalent payments to Swain and Graham County. Now, we never actually encouraged the construction of floating homes or non-navigable houseboats. What we did do in the 1970s was recognize the fact that we had them. We grandfathered existing structures after the fact by issuing about 900 permits, so these structures didn't have to be removed immediately. We also at the time prohibited new structures. We did this in the form of a regulation that has been published in the Code of Federal Regulations since 1978. These permits gave no right to remain on the reservoir in perpetuity, and TVA believed these structures would actually disappear over time. And I don't know how that assumption was made, but it was obviously an incorrect assumption. Many of the 1970-era structures have been now transferred to new owners or modified, and the problem was compounded by inconsistent or lax enforcement of the TVA policy, with the result that the number of floating homes actually doubled. Several years ago, we got very concerned about some environmental and operational problems at these houses, and also about the proliferation of them. We actually found some marketing data about a 200 floating home subdivision to be built right in Knoxville, Tennessee, and we saw a couple things like this. So we began a thorough policy review, public input process under the National Environmental Policy Act, and we identified we had about 1,800, I think 1,836 exactly, floating houses on the reservoir. We took great care to consider all perspectives during the public input process. A lot of people urged us to remove the houses immediately. They argued that if a citizen built a house in a national forest or a hunting lodge in a national park, these would be removed immediately. Others expressed concern about safety and environmental issues, gray water, anchoring, electrical connections. Structure owners and marina operators were generally receptive to better regulation, but obviously wanted the structures to remain. We estimated in the NEPA process that if we did nothing, the number of floating houses would again double over the next 30 years. We got input from the Federal Advisory Committee on Natural Resources, a FACA, which has a gubernatorial appointment from each of the states we are in. That board advised a 20-year sunset period. So I think there's a general consensus by all parties that health, safety, and environmental standards have to improve for these houses. So after the review, the TVA board approved a policy to establish new safety and environmental standards for existing structures. As has been noted, the policy also prohibits new floating houses, which technically have been prohibited since 1978, and requires all floating houses to be removed from the reservoirs within 30 years. So we believe the extensive sunset period helps mitigate, helps balance the impact on the floating homeowners. I do want to note that concerns that Chairman Meadows expressed actually helped move that sunset from 20 to 30 years. For us, alternatives to the sunset provision imply indefinite personal property rights for a select few on a public resource. And neither TVA nor the TVA board believe it has the authority to create personal property rights in publicly owned resources. And we think the Congress is really the only body that has the right to do that. So with that, I'll look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Sneed, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective on the impact of TVA's decision to sunset floating homes. I'm Laura Sneed, and I'm the co-founder of Fontana Families for Floating Houses, and I'm also a member of the Tennessee Valley Floating Home Alliance. I'm also a wife and a full-time working mother of 2 boys and 2 grown stepchildren. Prior to moving to Cherokee, North Carolina, I grew up in Minnesota with memories of time spent at the lake. All I wanted was for my children and future grandchildren to have similar life experiences, and floating homes allowed us to do that. As we were an expanding family, my husband Eric and I purchased 2 modest, grandfathered pre-1978 non-navigable houseboats on Fontana Lake. In February 2006, the TVA announced they were recommending a 20-year sunset provision based on their recently completed environmental impact statement. This was an involuntary removal of 1,836 floating homes from the TVA reservoirs, and included the 918 previously grandfathered homes. I was completely shocked and devastated, as I never expected my family would lose our homes. Ultimately, the TVA board voted for a 30-year sunset, but the financial and emotional impacts have been felt immediately. This decision has created pain and anxiety from so many U.S. citizens with varying income levels, races, ages, and political party affiliations. These homeowners are not only from North Carolina and Tennessee, but also travel from Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia. On Fontana Lake, many homeowners are also enrolled members of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, including my husband and my children. As responsible homeowners and frequent users of the lake, most of us are not against reasonable regulations. The majority of homeowners are worried about the proposed annual fee of 50 cents per square foot for non-grandfathered and modified homes. If the fees were to apply to our homes, they would be a 50% increase in our cost to legally moor them. According to the TVA, up to 20 to 30% of the homes will be removed after these go into effect. That's up to 550 families who are going to lose their American dream. The sunset will also have a negative impact on all our local economies and may destroy the family-run businesses of our marinas. According to the Alarka Boat Dock owner, Tony Sherrill, homeowners make up to 50% of his revenue. When one couples the loss of income with the extreme annual drawdown of Fontana, which puts the marinas and homes actually on the ground for several months, they may not be able to diversify and survive. Without the marinas, the already limited lake access will significantly decrease, and that will be a huge detriment to the public. The TVA has cited concerns in their EIS justifying the removal, including homes moored out of marinas and electrical and water quality issues. In reality, only about 2 homes are not moored in the marina limits. At Fontana, homeowners don't have shore power. We do, however, pay monthly mooring fees and have contracts to pump our raw sewage. Ironically, the TVA did not conduct or include any water quality studies in their report. Fortunately, in 2006, an extensive study was performed on Fontana, showing that the water quality was generally excellent. As a steward and user of the lake, I care deeply about our environment, and as a protective mother, I would never allow my babies to swim in the lake if it was not safe. The most recent concern raised by the TVA officials involved the private use of a public resource. This implies the ownership of a floating home is somehow a social concern of fairness driven by privilege. In Swain County, there are 171 houseboats with a taxable value of $3.5 million. That averages out to less than $21,000 per home, which is less than a brand new pontoon boat. Technically, everyone who uses the lake is privately using a public resource. Should the TVA also ban boats as everyone cannot afford one? We worked hard and bought our homes. Should we all lose them because someone else didn't get the exact same opportunities? We know life isn't fair, but everyone is just trying to live the American dream. If everything in this country was regulated in an effort to balance wealth and property, we'd be another failed communist state, which is not the principles this nation was founded on. The TVA also claimed that they're sunsetting floating homes in the interest of the people. Prior to the TVA board meeting, we started an I-petition that received over 3,700 signatures and 900 comments. In addition to public support, Congressman Meadows and Senators Burr and Tillis have introduced legislation to allow them to stay. 7 congressmen and women from Tennessee sent the TVA a joint letter in favor of the homes. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the Tennessee State Legislature, and numerous local counties have all passed resolutions opposing the TVA's sunset. The TVA board has chosen to ignore all of these public officials in spite of the fact they are voted in by the people and serve the interests of the people. In conclusion, the recent actions of the TVA board are a clear example of government overreach that will have a negative impact on our local economies, small businesses, and American families. My family followed the rules, paid the fees, have our permits, and brought our homes up to decent standards. Yet we too are being unfairly punished and going to lose something we legally had the right to own. Although the TVA is a government entity, I ask who is overseeing their actions and who is holding them accountable. The TVA reservoirs are built for the people of the United States, and as citizens served by that mission, we just want to continue to enjoy them as we have done for decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sneed. Commissioner Monteith, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Congressman Meadows, committee members, thank you for the opportunity to letting us come today and testify of how important houseboats are on Fontana Lake. I would like to thank you, Congressman Meadows, for this opportunity especially. This is very, very devastating to Swain County if we have to lose these. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is David Monteith. I'm a Swain County Commissioner. I'm here today to let you know how the removal of houseboats from Fontana Lake would affect the health of Swain County and Graham County. I also chaired the Fontana Lake Waste Recovery, which wrote the ordinance not only for Swain County but for 7 states with TVA. Also went with TVA and presented to 47 other states this ordinance to make this work everywhere, because it does work. Fecal coliform went from over 12,000 or 1,200 down to less than 35. But in 1943, we're going to talk about in 1943, National Park was added to Swain County. This took an additional 44,000 acres of land. Over 3,000 citizens then lost their homes. Today, 86% of federal land is owned by the federal government. Only 14% is taxable for Swain County. Folks, that's hard to exist and work with a 14%, and taking these houseboats off of the lake would be devastating for that. In the midst of World War II, TVA took more than 11,000 acres of land from Swain County and Graham County to build Fontana Lake. It was to be helped to use as a war effort. The people of Swain County were told the power was needed to help end the war and to build a bomb which would help end the war. Yet, the Swain County citizens were forced to leave their lands. Legal actions was taken that said they have to do so. If they don't want to, they've still got to do so. They were taking condemned land. But we have Judge Yates Webb held in a district court back in 1950s that this was illegal against the Constitution of the United States to take and condemn land. But we lost schools, we lost cemeteries, we lost cemetery graves, we lost settlements, churches, post offices, hotels, boarding houses, grocery stores, train depots, sidetracks, ferries, hunting lodges, doctors, midwives, hospitals, blacksmith shop, orchards, grist mills, gas stations, sawmills, splash dams. These are things that Swain County lost. And again, we lost because of not only the TVA part of this, an additional 44,000 acres, we had already lost from the first national park, the same thing again. We lost over 6,000 people because of what's going on today. And we need, enough is enough. It don't need to be continued. As you plainly see, the efforts for changing have been served. Houseboat owners are asked to be forced off. This would lose Swain County over $3 million of valuation, $12,000 just to the economy of Swain County. And that, again, is devastating when you only have a 14% tax base to work with. If Swain County loses houseboats on Fontana Lake, we will lose, as I said, $12,000 in taxes and over $3 million in valuation. And that don't count the other side of the lake, Graham County. They will double the same thing that we do. So that's how much the western North Carolina area will lose. 86%, as I've said, of Swain County is federal land. Fontana Lake Waste Recovery has cleaned the human waste out of Fontana Lake. We have brought it down from 1,400 cc's down to less than 35. This was written because, local doctors told us how filthy Fontana Lake was because of houseboats. but there was nothing there to enforce it. So we wrote an ordinance to make it enforceable and got houseboat owners involved in doing this one thing. And it's brought it down to less than 35. So that's how clean the lake is today. And we're very proud of it. TVA is proud of it because they adopted it to other states and other lakes. So they know the effects of what has happened to Swain County. So I do appreciate the consideration of this committee to help us to keep Fontana Lake clean, not only Fontana Lake, but other committees. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Wilkes, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and a privilege to sit here before you this morning representing the Tennessee Valley Floating Home Alliance. We're a group of floating home owners, marina operators, renters, and people who enjoy the recreational resources of the Tennessee reservoirs. On May 5th, 2016, the TVA officials recommended a so-called alternative B2 to the TVA Board of Directors for adoption from among several other options outlined in the environmental impact statement. TVA had commissioned for the purpose of dealing with the floating home issue. Under alternative B2, TVA would approve existing floating houses that met new minimum standards and would allow for the mooring within permitted harbor limits, but also would establish a future sunset date at which time all existing floating homes must be forcibly removed from the TVA reservoirs, including previously permitted non-navigables. Based on its officials' recommendation, the TVA board adopted alternative B2, but in doing so extended the sunset period from 20 to 30 years. Why now, after almost 40 years of inactivity, did the TVA want to take such a draconian approach to the issue? Why harm the people who believed that they were in compliance? Why harm local economies that rely on tourism dollars? Why not regulate and allow marina owners who the TVA has entrusted to be stewards of the harbors to monitor these structures? Why hadn't the TVA done its job? Based on inaccuracies and exaggerations, the TVA painted a picture to the public that floating homeowners represented a basket of deplorables, squatters, polluters, and those taking the waters as their own, all to justify the removal of floating homes. TVA officials failed to inform the public, and to some extent the board, that 98% of all floating homes are moored within the confines of marina harbors in waters leased by the TVA. Floating homes do not represent an unacceptable taking of public waters for private use, as TVA actually leases these waters in which these vast majority of floating homes are moored to marine owners. Marine owners pay TVA a fee to lease these waters, and floating homeowners, in turn, pay marina owners to sublease the mooring space. In order to be moored on Marina Harbor, floating homeowners must contract with either the marina owner itself or a qualified wastewater disposal company for the proper disposal of wastewater. The TVFHA represents many stakeholders in this issue, not only from Tennessee and North Carolina, but also from states such as Georgia, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Florida, Arizona, Kentucky, and Virginia. Floating homeowners travel to reservoirs for weekends or a week or two of vacation. Many local people believe that the TVA would do nothing as usual. The TVA makes rules that they never follow or enforce was the sentiment of many. The TVA was mandating this forced removal, and this time the TVA apparently meant it. In April 2016 meeting of the TVA Regional Resource Stewardship Council, Ms. Rebecca Toline, TVA Vice President of Natural Resources, stated that she was, quote-unquote, hell-bent on removing floating houses. During the scoping process involved in the EIS, there were many comments related to the inconsistencies of the TVA. Marine operators like Debbie Samples stated on June 24th, 2014 public meeting that she spoke to a TVA official around 1997 and was told it was okay to build floating home in her marina, and that the TVA was going to allow marinas to do what they wanted within the harbors. There are stories like Mary Ann and Tom Lefker, who built floating home after talking with TVA official, who led them to believe that the TVA was not regulating these structures anymore. Others reiterated hearing the same sentiments from the TVA. Now these owners and others are to be levied fees, and at the end of 30 years would be required to pay for the forced removal of their floating home from the lake. Marina owners stand to lose 40% or more of their revenues which will be difficult to recover, forcing many to close. Revenues to counties in Tennessee would suffer significantly from the sunset. Campbell County, with 11 marinas, which collectively generate an estimated $33 million of the total $54.24 million in tourism dollars spent in the county. Personal estimates of over $8,000 per year for basic floating home costs, which over a conservative estimate number of 400 units brings $3.2 million to the Campbell County economy alone. This is exclusive of the purchase of fuel, groceries, dining, and other items. Tourism is the only growth industry in the region since 2008, and now jobs would be lost. Campbell County Mayor E.L. Morton states, "This is a slap in the face to the citizens of the county, which has lost jobs in the mining industry as a result of the TVA not buying coal mined in the region." Our family made a choice to purchase floating home on Norris Reservoir because of the cleanliness of the water, the beauty of the mountains, and the heritage and the friendliness of its people, bringing truth to the term Southern hospitality. This is not the only story of its kind, as evidenced in the public comment sections at 2 TVA board meetings, letters to state and federal legislators, and over 600 comments in a petition presented to the TVA. While some on the TVA board believe that the additional time the board granted to floating homeowners would significantly mitigate the lost value suffered by owners, the real impact is today. TVA staff has belabored the point that floating homes, not unlike boats, depreciate in value over time. But if they are well-maintained or improved, they are likely to maintain or increase their value. Those that have sold have done so at values often below cost. Retirees like Janet and Gary Benzinger or Ray and Hazel Beal, retired couple in their 80s, either lost thousands of dollars on the sale or couldn't sell it at all. TVA staff wrongly assumed that these structures were built and handed down for generations into perpetuity. Our findings show that these structures are bought and sold on an average of 5 to 8 years as financial demands and family situations change. Marina owners have commented in meetings with the TVA that they have complied with the regulations regarding sewage and black water. Marinas are private contractors that pump out these vessels required by the TVA to keep records including gallons pumped and where the waste is disposed of. These records are rarely, if ever, inspected by the TVA. After approximately 40 years of what has been essentially regulatory neglect and often conflicting regulatory guidance from various TVA officials, the TVA apparently made the internal decision that it would be easier to force off all floating homes from the lakes than to create fair regulatory policies and maintain effective compliance programs to enforce them. And if floating homeowners, marina owners, local governments lost tens of millions of dollars in uncompensated home value and tax revenue in the process, it was no concern to the TVA. Apparently, in an effort to build its case for the decision, the TVA commissioned an EIS that was heavy on conclusions to justify the removal of floating homes, but light on the research to back up those conclusions. For example, the EIS concluded that floating homes hurt the water quality of TVA lakes, but did not include any real research to back up those conclusions. And in fact, left out water quality research that showed excellent water quality on Fontana Lake. Those not from the Tennessee Valley are unaware of the contradictions that the TVA has created. Is the TVA a government agency or a private corporation responsible for driving profits from the sale of electricity? They're also unaware that the board is comprised of presidential appointees and that millions of dollars in salaries are paid to the executives of this federal corporation. The board realized that it had a real decision to make, which required more thought than usually needed. They didn't fathom that over 50 floating homeowners, marina owners, and others would travel some 8 hours to state the position that the vast majority of floating homes are not as they are described in the EIS. We give much credit to Chairman Joe Rich and especially Directors Michael McWhorter and Marilyn Brown for their attention. Directors McWhorter and Brown held a position of holding off a decision and directing the staff to further investigate the matter. This will allow time to correct the admitted blundering the TVA had done in the past. We can all agree that there needs to be a registration or inventory of existing structures, including mooring systems, water lines, electric cables, and the various marinas. This needs to be done in conjunction with the marinas and organizations such as the TVFHA. Concise and sensible safety requirements must be developed, including a plan for future recreational use of structures like these. Where we have a difficulty in reaching a meeting of the minds of the TVA is in the notion that floating homes represent an unacceptable private taking of public waters. You see, marinas on Norvis Reservoir represent only 1.9% of the total surface area of the reservoir. At the suggestion of the board, we and other groups have met with the staff to work on proposed regulations and develop a plan moving forward. The TVA recognizes the TVFHA as a voice and a mechanism to communicate new requirements and work towards better stewardship. We have asked the TVA to be included as a representative from our organization on the RRSC, so there can be a fair and balanced discussion on stewardship matters. We have also committed to an ambassador program with marinas and homeowners to help communicate the standards and assist in the registration and compliance measures, thus reducing costs for the TVA. The TVA has an opportunity to turn its negative perception into a positive means for persons of the United States to utilize the resources in a positive and sustainable manner without removing those structures within compliance. Like floating home associations in California and Washington, where floating homeowners and their government regulators have learned how to peacefully coexist, there is an opportunity to work together here in a nonpartisan manner if the TVA would just avail itself of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkes. Mr. Butler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Conley, and members of the committee for allowing me to address this important issue. I have spent a large portion of my life on the reservoirs that TVA manages, traveling across the entire river valley and spending a lot of time on most of the reservoirs out of the 49. Witnessing firsthand the importance of the public resources and the values they bring to the entire state of Tennessee, where I live. In my capacity as CEO of the Tennessee Wildlife Federation, I have sat across the table from TVA and challenged them hard on taking care of our public resources, but I've also sat on the same side of the table with them and helping them accomplish the same. The issue of non-navigable floating houses on public reservoirs is not new, as well spoken here by the other testimony. We find that in 1971, the first prohibition was placed on new non-navigable floating houses in the Federal Register. But what's remarkable to us is that out of the 1,836 floating homes on the reservoirs, 930 of them occurred after the second prohibition was placed on the construction and location of these on our public reservoirs. Today, we are here to review a new prohibition on floating houses once again. This new chapter builds on previous ones, apparently catalyzed by discussions of plans to incite entire new subdivisions of floating homes on our public reservoirs. The public reservoir system in Tennessee are the backbone and attraction of a strong outdoor recreation economy, and their conservation is why we support the recently approved TVA board policy. Public resources only have value inasmuch as they are available to the public. What makes this possible is rational use provided by law, and TVA manages these public resources under Section 26A of the TVA Act. As such, we believe these public resources should not be impeded or made de facto private property by allowing permanent floating houses on public waters. Floating houses exclude the public from being able to utilize the water they occupy in particular and can negatively impact public uses of the larger public reservoirs as a whole. While some argue against this policy, saying that these structures help the local economy, which they do, the reality of the economic impacts of floating houses is much more dynamic than just that simple analysis. As stated in the 2016 AIS, floating houses may work to depress shoreline property values and negatively impact surface recreational opportunities. Add to this that floating houses are being used as rental properties, and this further exacerbates these negative impacts. Generally speaking, our Federation is not opposed to businesses operating on public waters or lands as long as the activities or services being offered do not degrade the natural resources involved and that they do not exclude other legitimate uses of these public resources. In our opinion, floating houses do not pass either of these tests. Waste, navigation, and electrical safety issues, as stated, are also well-identified concerns. I cite the recently completed EIS again, which says an increase in the number of floating homes is expected to exacerbate water pollution problems, adding to the cumulative wastewater loading to surface waters. Leaking of human and household waste into public reservoirs is a hazard to aquatic life and recreational users as well. Who is responsible for this compliance? And if the new policy is removed, is this removal effectively an unfunded mandate to the Tennessee Department of Environment Conservation to enforce these measures? So while some will argue that wastewater and electrical safety can be regulated, the sheer fact that hundreds of these structures have been placed on our public reservoirs without permitting or oversight over a handful of decades in direct violation of federal rules makes a clear statement that the rules and standards designed to protect the public's interest and these resources are not being followed. What evidence do we have that this will change? If past history is a predictor of future performance, it won't. Lastly, and of great importance to millions who love to fish our public reservoirs, we believe the presence of floating houses diminishes the experience of and deters use by anglers who seek to use these public waters and fisheries resources, especially when they are occupied. In Tennessee, these anglers have a constitutional right to hunt and fish. And with allowing de facto private ownership of these reservoirs, it is arguable that this is in direct conflict with these activities and arguably this right. We believe that no citizen should have a presumption of ownership of public waters, especially when it comes at the expense of other citizens with equal claim to ownership and use. There are good reasons why we cannot build a home in a national park, and there are equally good reasons why these structures were prohibited and regulated starting in 1971. I would like to close by noting that we believe this policy is squarely aligned with TVA's 26A authority. This is a tough issue, no doubt, but we find that TVA addressed it comprehensively and professionally, choosing a policy that protects the greatest public interest and our public reservoirs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Connolly, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Butler, for your testimony, and I would be remiss if I didn't recognize your daughter, who is here out of school for a civics lesson, so I want to recognize her.
Yes, sir.
And we'll give you that letter that you requested, so that it's an excused absence. No.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I assume you'll also give a selfie opportunity with the young lady to make sure that it's accurate. Appreciate the panel being here today. I must admit, when I left high school, majored in forestry and land management. Didn't end up in that field, but I love the outdoors, love stewardship of our resources. But I also, as a patriotic citizen, understand that this country is ours, including the waterways. And too often we get a mindset that appears that government will control that. It's government lands that we give at times back to the use of people. I don't like that idea at all. I live in the beautiful Irish Hills area of Michigan, beautiful waterways, lakes, and we have some houseboats on some of those lakes. We also have residences that surround these lakes that go right up to the water in times. We found ways to deal with it. We found ways of taking septic systems out, putting grinder pumps, pumping up to municipal sewage systems, dealing at times with taking out wells and putting in public water. But we try to keep people on the lakes and using the lakes as well. We have a public entity here with the TVA. And Mr. Johnson, I appreciate the fact that you want to carry out regulation appropriately. But the TVA has a staggering amount of debt, which is a federal government corporation and connected to the federal deficit as well. Taking this into account, wouldn't you consider compensation packages worth millions of dollars for TVA executives excessive? And we're talking about, in fact, top executives at TVA being paid nearly 15 times as much as the salary for President Obama and nearly 30 times the salary of the U.S. Secretary of Energy is really necessary? In context now, talking about controlling water resources that, as Mr. Monith explained, took away a lot of land, a lot of resources, a lot of buildings and structures from people, and while providing a service, certainly, yet the excessive costs here, and we're talking about concerns about people living on houseboats. So let me ask that question again.
Sure. Well, actually, the compensation of people at TVA is specified in a federal statute. It's in the TVA Act, the measures, how it is to be constructed, and it was a recognition in 2005 that TVA is actually the largest utility in this country, I think. We operate 7 nuclear plants. It is like running a large IOU, and if you need to get the talent and skills of people to do that, you need to pay them, and we make about half or less of peers in private industry. So compared to other government employees, we're better paid compared to industry or we're not.
Well, you're not private industry.
Right.
You're government employees. And here we're talking about families, families that have put up a houseboat for a purpose in life that really comes with the reality of life, liberty, and prosperity, or happiness, as it was put. And we have regulatory agencies that continue to expand while being in huge debt. And we're concerned about this particular issue and not finding a way to address the values and lifestyle of these people. Let me go to Ms. Sneed. In your testimony, you recount how you followed the rules. You paid thousands of dollars in fees. You received Section 26A permit from TVA. How'd you feel when the board announced its policy to remove all floating homes from the TVA reservoirs within 20 years and now 30 years?
Well, when I received my postcard in the mail, I was kind of going through my mail and I read it and I was just taken aback, and I was shocked because, I mean, we did it right. These houses, our houses have been there probably since the 50s, and the fact that they're taking those away too, and just taking them all away, it's devastating for us, and then getting to know everyone else, the people that aren't grandfathered. It's hurting a lot of people, and at first I didn't even know what to do, and so it took us like a month and a half to get going, but, that we needed to fight this, but it was devastating, and, I mean, Fontana is kind of a cash, lake, so our house values are not as high as others. So we put a lot of money from our savings account into these houses, to replace the black floats and, to make our sinks pump into a septic tank and, to make them, more environmental friendly and safe for our children, because there was a beaver that lived under our house and it ate our floor. And so to, basically lose a lot of money from your savings account and everything, it was hard, it was devastating.
And future plans as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wanted my kids to be able to swim on the lake. It's, North Carolina is very different than Minnesota. You can't just buy a cheap cabin and, bring your family up and just walk down to the lake. And, we looked at properties, but it's really expensive. It's very limited on Fontana. Most of the land is either Forest Service or National Park. There are some private opportunities, but they're very expensive compared to, buying land in Swain County. Normally, you might be able to buy, an acre for $10,000, a quarter, half acre is $500,000 on the lake. So it's not proportionate to what the people make in the area, and so I mean, the floating homes allow normal people to actually use the lake.
Okay. Mr. Wilkes, you argue that floating homes do not represent an unacceptable taking of public waters for private use. Could you explain that further?
The marinas pay a lease fee to the TVA. Contrary to their accusation or their assumptions out there that there's over 98% of these floating homes or these structures are within marina confines. They've already leased an area to a private entity,
So
to a private marina.
define marina confines for me, if you would. What's that
Those
look
are
like?
Within a harbor or set harbor limits by the TVA.
And that's already leased to the owners of the marina.
Yes, it is, sir.
So the marina really decided what they want to do with their space, correctly?
Correct.
And they've given that to floating homes.
They've given
Houseboats.
some of that area to floating homes, some of it to their own docks for, private slips, for
Fishing purposes.
for fishing purposes, for, storage of boats, for storage of production houseboats. They're docked all along, or within those harbors.
And so that's, you said 90%,
Yes.
generally speaking.
Yes, actually, by TVA estimates, it was 98%.
Of already,
Roughly
98% of leased property, 98% of the houseboats are on already leased property
Yes,
that isn't taking away anything that wasn't given by TVA already.
correct.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this hearing. This is illuminating for me to some degree, but I appreciate your efforts to move forward on this and try to find a suitable answer to make sure that resources are cared. We want that. But also that personal choices and personal liberty and the opportunity for doing something with your lifestyle on the remaining lands that aren't controlled somehow, some way by federal government, that seems to be getting more and more, that we give these opportunities. So thank you.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Connolly.
I thank my friend, the chairman, and I thank him for this hearing. I must take issue with Mr. Wahlberg. I mean, unlimited, quote, personal liberty. You want to see where that can lead? Let's look at the Detroit River that poisoned the people of Flint, Michigan. There is a role for federal government. There is a role for government regulation. It protects people. And I cannot abide the assertion of a philosophy that virtually leads to unlimited pollution of waterways.
Would the gentleman yield?
Briefly.
Briefly. I'm not asking.
Only because I have 5 minutes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean that to be rude.
I'm not asking for unlimited
Okay.
at all. But I'm asking for some type of reasonable care for that personal liberty that we all believe in. And I don't see this here, and especially when I see an entity that is so huge in debt.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
Reclaiming my time, I say to my friend, I agree with that. In fact, I said that in my opening. I think this is a matter, we have to strike a balance here between that and the need to protect public waterways or semi-public waterways. But I think we have to be careful in how we express that, because at least on our side of the aisle, we get off. I mean, and the people you're trying to protect, if we frame it in such stark terms, I think we lose support we otherwise might get, because certainly this member is not, with a strong environmental record, is not unsympathetic to the plight, nonetheless, of the individuals who are affected here, who thought they were making decisions that would be protected or not challenged, and I'm totally sympathetic with that plight. So, at any rate, Ms. Sneed, I want to make sure I understand your testimony. How long have you lived on this floating house?
We bought the first house in 2014, and then the second house we bought in 2015. So the first house we actually bought from a family that their real house burned down, and they
Okay.
used it as an asset.
All right, so you're relatively new.
We are.
And where'd you come from?
I'm from
Oh, you said Minnesota.
from
right?
Minnesota. I met my husband working on a project. He's from Cherokee, North Carolina, and
Okay.
married and moved down here.
All right. Now, do you have a permit?
We do. We have two.
You do. Okay. Would you agree that anyone who's on the lake or the reservoir ought to have a permit, because that's what's required by law?
We do. And so in North Carolina, the houses that don't have TVA permits are registered as North Carolina boats. And a lot of them have steering wheels, and they can actually drive them around. So in our first spot, the previous neighbor actually would take theirs out and drive the lake like a houseboat.
No, I understand, but I'm trying to get at sort of, I was in local government like Mr. Money. 14 years, I did rezonings, a lot more than you probably have done in a lifetime, because it's Fairfax County, right? So I did thousands of rezonings. And it is not up for opinion whether the government has a right to insist on permitting and licensing and certain regulations with respect to lot size and what you can build and if you can build and sewer lines and all that stuff. I mean, that's what we did for a living to protect the public. Now, sometimes opinions can clash about how far government goes and do you really need to be doing that? And I found myself on both sides of that as a local elected official. Sometimes I saw government at its worst, and sometimes, thank God, I saw it at its best. And all I'm trying to get here is you certainly, because I don't want to misconstrue your testimony, you agree that it is within the purview of TVA to issue permits, that you, if you're going to have a floating house, you got to have a permit.
Yes, that is
Okay.
correct.
And you heard Mr. Johnson's testimony that unfortunately, when they grandfathered it in, even those that previously, before you got onto the reservoir, that were without a permit, they finally decided, let's make them all legal, and we'll grant 900 and something permits and start over so that nobody's illegal. That's our solution. In the past, that's what they did. You heard that.
Yes.
And what happened?
People continued to build because it was not regulated.
That's right.
But other
Well,
people-
it was technically regulated, but they didn't enforce it.
Correct.
Yeah. So we went from 900 to 1,800, which would suggest that half the homes, floating homes, were or are illegal. That is to say, without a permit. Is that correct, Ms. Johnson?
That is in fact correct, yeah.
Okay. So a lot of your neighbors are there illegally.
Sort of, because they're registered as boats on our lake.
So there's a sort of getting around the permit requirement.
I mean, they can drive them around as boats, so we chose to get permits.
Right.
Other people,
Okay, but you at least you know
Yes.
TVA, that is the governing authority here under law, considers them illegal, right?
we just went out of our way to make sure that.
No, I know, you're clean with the Lord, good. All right, so but I think you would agree as a citizen, right? We can't have people exercising illegal options, right? We all want to be within the law. Okay. And within the law is our protection. It's your protection. You're illegal, I can't do anything.
But they're taking us
Well,
off.
no, hold that in the bands. I'm talking about day-to-day stuff. Whereas if I operate outside the law, not only am I at risk, but so's the public, because I may be leaking or violating other things that you have gone to great trouble not to do. You've got, from what I understand from your testimony, you've gone to great expense and expense to make sure that you're an environmentally sensitive floating home, so you're not polluting the waterway you're situated in. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would that be a fair? Okay. So now, Mr. Butler, going to balance. I know you conceded that this is a tough decision, but can't we find some middle path between you're out of here in 30 years, which instantly has an impact on not only psychology, but on home values, and protecting a natural resource, which I agree with you, has to be protected, and that's the responsibility of TVA. And we heard from Mr. Wilkes, part of the problem here is the inconsistency of TVA's enforcement. And that is as bad as a bad law. If it's on the books and it's the law, it needs to be enforced consistently so that everybody understands. The expectations are uniform across the board. And TVA hasn't done that, according to Mr. Wilkes, and no one has gainsaid that testimony. And I think that's a very fundamental problem. Because, Mr. Johnson, one of the problems here is, once you're gone, will your successor enforce this or care? Are we once again going to be up in the air about what's expected, wink, blink, what is the law and all that? So, at any rate, Mr. Butler, my time's up, but I would like you to at least help address the balance, because I didn't hear a lot of sympathy in your testimony. I mean, I heard passionate advocacy for the environment, which I share. But there are human beings who are going to be affected here most of whom, through no fault of their own, find themselves caught in this conundrum, and they may not want to leave. They may not. They certainly don't want that cloud hanging over their heads of uncertainty. And can't there be a middle way that allows us to have an environmental solution while still allowing people to stay in their homes and exercise the personal liberty Mr. Wahlberg talked about?
Well, we are certainly empathetic to the plight of the folks that have invested their hard-earned dollars into those structures. We would look at this in a couple of different ways. One is we find it remarkable that there would be a presumption of permanent residency on public resources. In other words, we understand that TVA didn't follow up on their 78 policy and enforce it, per your points. But we also think the citizens have a responsibility to make sure that they're registered. When I buy a car, I have a responsibility to go get it registered.
We've established that, and Ms. Snead doesn't take any issue with that. She agrees. She's done that.
But the problem is, Mr. Conley, is that half of these facilities ignored that and took no responsibility. And if that is the historical context, we are concerned that the future context could be similar. Now, having said that, we responded in our testimony and in our response to TVA in their EIS process, the NEPA process, around the alternatives that they gave. There are other potential alternatives that could be based around ownership of the bottom of the reservoirs, in our opinion. Potentially, you could look at areas where flowage easements were purchased. There are private property rights arguably owned by individuals, where TVA has the right to flood, but they don't own the surface or subsurface right under the water. If you anchor to that, then there might be an argument made that that could be a different situation versus if there are public lands underneath those waters that were taken in any other manner. And I think you could find some potential alternatives there, although we have not examined those and we have not discussed those with TVA.
Well, I'm glad you clarified that, because when you started talking about a solution being at the bottom of the reservoir, I got really nervous for Ms. Snead and everybody else. All right, thank you. And I hope your daughter got a bit of a taste of the wondrous democracy we have in the being able to express our opinions and not worry about it. Mr. Chairman, over to you. Thank you.
I thank the ranking member. Commissioner Monteith, did you want to comment? I saw you look like you wanted to jump in on that. Before I start my series of questions, I'll recognize myself for asking questions, but I'll let you comment if you wanted to do so.
They determine, first of all, how many houseboats can be put in the harbor. You can't just go down and throw out 10,000 in the harbor. They tell TVA, they tell the dock owners how many they can put, and that's all they can put. Okay, also, the TVA law on houseboats, you know, they're navigable. These navigable laws are NC navigable laws that they told. You got TVA numbers and you got NC numbers. Those NC numbers, as Ms. Snead talked about, they have a motor on it, can view 180 degrees. You can see it. It can be moved around because that's the way the North Carolina law requires it. The other ones, the TVA, don't. They stay put solid. But again, how many is in a harbor is what it is. And TVA determines what goes on that lake, and we abide by that, not only with the harbor, but cleaning the lake up and keeping it clean to where it is clean on that lake.
All right.
I mean,
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead. Sure. Go
just
ahead.
following up
I'll
on what,
yield to you.
well, because we didn't give Mr. Monteith an opportunity, because I think it was pretty dramatic when you said you brought the pollution levels down.
Yes, sir.
From 1,400 to 35.
exactly right.
And just if the chairman isn't, I think we'd love to hear a little bit, how did you do that?
We done it because we got grants from TVA, $90,000. We got grants from Western Carolina University at $20,000. We got grants from Diener of $340,000. Grants from RC&D, state again, of $345,000. We got these grants together. We took that money and we bought Fontana Lake Waste Recovery. Because there was no ordinance enforcing the way, we wrote the ordinance so it could be forced, okay? We took the grant money, we bought each boat dock a pump-out boat. We built each boat dock a floating platform that would hold 1,000 gallons of waste. They could take their dock, go in, pump out her houseboat, and take it over and put it in to the holding tank, and then the state, or not the state, but the county would come by on the banks and pick it up and haul it out, just like a sewage on Bryson, in the county. That's what we done to make the lake clean. That's why. And not only that, but as I said, TVA sent me to other states to present what we done so they could do the same thing. And these other 7 states have done the same thing. We don't have private land to where they're running sewer lines and water lines and power lines under the lake. That's not on Fontana Lake. It's federal on one side, Forest Service, TVA, and you're in a harbor and limited to how many you can put in that harbor. And they mandate that to us. Okay, did that clear that up? It does, thank you. Good deal.
So, thank you. Mr. Butler, let me come to you. So, because you say you have traveled on most of the 49 reservoirs, so you've enjoyed it, you've fished, I assume you've fished, but your testimony was that you've enjoyed the reservoirs, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, and so in doing that and enjoying those, when was the last time you were on Fontana?
I would have had to have been probably in the late 90s.
All right, so you haven't been there for over 20 years?
Around there, maybe a little less.
But so you just prefer not to come to North Carolina, that's okay. You're from Tennessee, I got that. So you're enjoying the reservoirs in Tennessee?
Primarily, yes, sir.
And so it
Say to both you, Virginia's gorgeous.
yeah. So you ought to see Michigan. I can hear it. We can see where this is going. So, Mr. Butler, if you've been enjoying it, and so at this point, you would say that recreation on TVA reservoirs is pretty good, right?
I think it is. I think we have some challenges.
So let me ask you. Let me cut you off. I only got a limited time. If it's good, how has the 1,826 floating homes affected your enjoyment, your private enjoyment? Because your testimony, your sworn testimony is you've enjoyed it. Sure. And I want to know how these 1,826 floating homes have affected your private enjoyment, Mr. Butler.
Well, they haven't, but I'm not here.
Oh, okay, so they haven't. So then your concern is not with the 1,826 boats that we have there or floating homes that we have there. It would be if we increased it. Is that correct?
My concern is with the people I represent, with the Wildlife Federation.
Oh,
and their
okay,
use of
all
the
right.
reservoir.
So it's not really about private enjoyment as much as it is your official capacity.
Their private enjoyment.
Oh, so you're saying you can enjoy it, but they can't?
No, I'm saying that the private enjoyment of those people that I represent, like the Tennessee Striped Bass Association that recreates primarily on Norris Reservoir.
All right. I'm a fisherman. I'm an angler. You know where I catch most of the fish? Under docks and under floating homes. Wouldn't you agree with that? You know, you're a wildlife guy.
That's why in my testimony I particularly stated the impact of when they're occupied. Because when they're occupied, people don't like.
Oh, you scare the
fishing
fish
around.
away when they're
No,
occupied.
they don't like getting in the personal space of the
Mr.
people that
Butler,
are on the dock.
this is sworn testimony, so how many fish have you talked to?
Zero, sir.
Okay, all right. So let me make a point. This is sworn testimony, and here's what I'm asking you to do.
Sure.
Let's identify the barriers to fixing this problem, and let's dispense with the pontification of what may or may not happen in the future. I'm willing. In fact, Mr. Johnson, wouldn't you agree that I spoke to you and your chief of staff on numerous occasions? You once, your chief of staff on numerous occasions.
That's more than accurate.
Okay,
Yes, we've
all
heard
right.
a lot from you.
You've heard a lot from me. Did I not tell you that I was willing to put in some reasonable restrictions in permitting and actually find a process? In fact, I said we ought to use Mr. Monteith's model and make that a requirement for all of the reservoirs in terms of working that over, that I wanted to find some common ground. Did I not tell you that?
Absolutely, you did.
All right. So if we're looking, and Mr. Butler's private enjoyment hasn't been affected to date, in fact, I guess, Mr. Butler, since you're saying this is a private taking, is that what you're saying? That was what your sworn testimony was? This was a private taking? I heard that.
I don't know if I use that exact word, but it's possible. Yes, we would say this is a private exclusion of other public use.
All right. So would a marina be a private of other public use?
If it goes through the process
Would a
established by
dock
TVA,
Would a dock be? Because it is. You know, here's the thing is we're talking about floating homes, and your testimony would be inconsistent if that was the premise of what you're talking about. Because all of those would be private takings of a public entity, would they not? So you're saying getting rid of everything on the lake?
No, sir, we're not.
Well, then why make the
Because
distinction?
these are being established as residences
Oh,
versus
okay.
day-use boats that are typically.
So
at
how many
marinas.
people live there 365 days a year?
I have no idea.
Okay, I can tell you, because I don't normally ask questions that I don't know the answers for, and the answer is 0. So it's not a residence. So are you saying that we need to get rid of docks and marinas too? Is that your testimony?
I definitely would believe that we need to be smart about locating docks and marinas so they don't impede upon these values that I mentioned in testimony.
What values is that?
Access, navigation.
All right, but we haven't heard any, Mr. Johnson, in fact, I think in his testimony has said that there is not an access problem or a navigation problem. Isn't that correct, Mr. Johnson?
I don't believe I said that.
Well, you have
Maybe I
public
did.
statements to that effect. So is there a navigation problem?
Yes, there are at some of these marinas
All
navigation
right,
problems.
so let me ask you this. So I want to go here because is it harder to move around a floating home that is stationary than a bass boat that is going 40 miles an hour?
I was not a physics student, but harder to move a houseboat. They're moored.
Is it easier to avoid a houseboat that is stationary than a moving boat that's going 40 miles an hour?
Typically, yes, but
Typically, yes, what? It's
yes, it's
easier to go around a
avoid
floating home.
a standing object than a moving object, yes. But the anchorages of some of these do pose navigation problems. I have some pictures here if you'd like to see.
When was the last time you were on Fontana?
Within the last 6 weeks.
Okay, and so do you see any anchorage problems on Fontana?
Now, I say Fontana is probably the best in terms of quality, environmental safety, anchorage. I
So
think that's-
why would the board not take what we're doing in Fontana and make it applicable for the other 49 reservoirs as a good example of good regulation like my good friend from Virginia is talking about? Why would you not do that?
Well, I think that is part of the plan to do that, which is
You mean
to-
for the next 30 years,
That's right. So to
until we get rid of them?
there are 2 points here. Yes, we need to improve our enforcement of standards, set standards, health, environmental standards. The reason I got interested in this a couple years ago is we had people in one of the reservoirs get so sick from swimming in sewage that they had to go to the hospital.
Not
That's
in
really what got my
Fontana?
attention. Wasn't Fontana.
So
So we will,
didn't I request that we just exempt some of the ones where you're not having problems? Didn't I tell you that?
is
Why
my
why don't we just exempt it if we're not having a problem?
my second point, which I actually do believe a permanent right to be there. If we have no sunsetability, we have created a permanent property right in public resources. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. Federal District Court in Western North Carolina, the
I'm
Honorable
familiar with the
Woodrow
case.
Jones, you know, she said, even a single houseboat moored to federal land interferes with the government ownership rights.
So are you saying this is federal land? Is that your testimony?
Sure it is.
So what part of water is federal land?
Well, the land
I
under
mean, I only know of one person who walked on water.
the land
So
under it
is
certainly
it
is.
land or is it water?
The land is federal land. The water is entrusted to the care of TVA under the TVA Act, and of course, the public owns the
All
water.
right, so what role does the EPA have in cleanliness?
I'm not
Do
sure.
they have any role on TVA waters?
I think the water quality is a matter of state law and state enforcement.
Well,
I believe.
state and federal, but
Yeah.
okay, so when you look at that,
Yeah.
are they monitoring the cleanliness of the lake?
I think everybody who draws water out of any lake or any river monitors it routinely, yes.
All right. And so is this environmental problem on Fontana?
As I said, Fontana has led the way here in environmental standards and other things.
All right, so was it your staff that recommended to the board to take this action?
Certainly, yes.
All right, and they did that based on what?
2 years of study, a number of public hearings, comment periods,
And they did
NEPA
that, why?
process.
Why? I mean, you don't just have a public hearing unless you have an outcry from the public, generally speaking. So how many complaints did you have?
I can't tell you the number. We had a,
Well, this is important to you, isn't it, Mr. Johnson?
it is important to me. It's
So,
really important.
and you've got all kinds of staff here.
Yeah.
So do you not know how many complaints you had?
No, I.
Can you
probably-
get that to the committee?
I'm sure we can.
All right.
But we had two
Did-
issues. We had two
Did
issues.
you have over 3,700 complaints?
I don't know.
Because we've got a petition of over 3,700 people who say they're going the other way.
Yeah, and I have a survey.
I'll be glad to yield to the gentleman.
Again, I'm putting on my old local government hat. I mean, and we're a big county. Oh, I got 1.2 million people I represented. Yeah, bigger than 7 states. But we're a complaint-based system.
Right.
So you don't know how many complaints you got about this?
I'm sure somebody does. I don't particularly know it.
Well, I think that's pretty material.
Well, could
I
be.
mean, if it turns, bad policy decisions get made if we overreact to a handful of complaints. If, on the other hand, you've got lots of substantive complaints and concerns that were expressed, and I know you had a fact-finding period, right?
Right.
But I think that's a pretty material figure to get back to us on, because I'd hate to think that all of this is about making 3 people happy.
No, it's not about making 3 people happy.
No, but that's the risk of what you've just done in answering the chairman. You should know that answer,
Right, well,
coming here testifying before the United States Congress.
the second part of this, though, is the proliferation of new floating homes that we're starting to see in marketing materials from developers from other places. And that's the other factor here. As I said, if we do nothing.
So what you're saying is that your primary concern is that we don't make it any worse than it is now? Is that your sworn
One
testimony?
primary concern is that we don't proliferate this. Another is that we have the right standard, and the third is that we don't create private property rights and public resources, because we
So
don't
which
think we
is-
have the power to do that.
Which is it?
All three.
Because we can address 2 of those.
Yeah.
So are you saying that you don't want floating homes on your lakes?
I think the floating homes for a reasonable period is good, but I think if you say they can never be sunset, that this is a perpetual right, that is creating personal property interest in public resources.
All right, so you say it's not fair. Is that what you're saying? You've had your vice president of natural resources say it's not fair. I heard that. So is that your testimony too? It's just not fair?
No, my testimony is it's not right.
All right, so it's not right. Is it right to condemn the property of landowners in Graham and Swain County and then take it and then try to manage it and make sure that they kept, because literally what happened in Graham and Swain County is you had patriotic Americans who says they were going to give up their homes to allow you to produce energy to win a war. And now all of a sudden, you're the fairness guru?
I think
I mean, is that fair? You took their land, now you're trying to tell them to get off of what you took originally. Is that fair?
so. I wasn't around when that
Mr.
happened.
Johnson, I know you weren't, neither was I, but you read, don't you?
Oh, yes, I read.
Did you condemn the land and did you
Absolutely.
take it?
Absolutely took it to help win World War II. There's no
And I'm
question
glad
about
we
that.
did.
Yes, sir.
And you know what? The people of Graham and Swain County are glad you did.
Yeah.
And all they want to do is get a little bit of it back. All they want to do. Now, here's what I want to ask you, Mr. Johnson. Is the board, and are you willing to recommend to the board a reasonable compromise where we can keep floating homes there? Are you willing to do that? Yes or no?
I'm willing to talk to them about that.
That's not my question.
Well,
that's a great. I'm
that's my
saying,
answer.
are you? No, I'm asking you a question, and it can be answered yes or no.
Right.
Are you and your staff willing to recommend to the board a reasonable compromise that would allow floating homes to remain?
I say no. I think we have reached
right,
a
that's-
reasonable
that-
compromise.
Well, why would you say that? I mean, if this is such an unbelievable priority for TVA, why don't you get rid of them tomorrow? If it's such an unbelievable, I mean,
So we have the authority today to remove half of them
Okay,
without.
I have the authority today to do a lot of things too, and so I'm going to go to the gentleman from Wisconsin and allow him to ask some questions, but we'll come back, because here's what I'm concerned about, Mr. Johnson. It's a double standard. It's a double standard. You know, really, when we start to look at all of this, we want to talk about fairness, and you are a federally mandated corporation, isn't that correct?
Yes, yes.
So when you look at the TVA Act, what part of it was actually in 33? Is that when the TVA?
33.
What part of that actually gave you the authority to really manage this particular aspect? Because in your opening testimony, it was interesting. You talked about, well, we're supposed to do power generation and we're supposed to manage natural resources. That was part of your opening statement.
Yes.
That was not in the Act of 1933. It talked about flood control, and it talked about power generation. It talked about fertilizer and weapons, and it talked about the environment, but it was really about reforestation of really a place that had all their timber cut, and it never contemplated this. I mean, I read it. I was up until 2 a.m. reading the entire, every dot and tittle, so it's not in there, and so your testimony is not in keeping with the TVA Act of 1933.
I actually think it's entirely consistent with it
Well,
under Section
we'll
26A.
agree to disagree, and I'm going to go to the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you. We'll give Ms. Snead a chance to say a little bit. How much does your family currently pay in annual fees? About?
So between the taxes, the pump fees, and mooring fees, it's a little over $2,000 a year.
And under their new rules, what do you think it's going to be about?
It's going to be a little over $3,000.
So about a 50% increase in one shot?
It is,
A lot.
for our family.
Okay. How does that affect your family? A lot, huh?
It will, but not as much as some people. I mean, there's some people that just, they have no money, and it's going to kick them off the lake.
Wow. You attended a meeting in August, a little while ago, with the floating homeowners and the TVA, and they revealed they'll lose up to 20 to 30% of the homes after the proposed regulations and fees go into effect. Would that be 400 to 500 families? Is that many people are going to leave, you think?
Well, there's going to be the initial permitting fees. I think it's either $250 or $500 depending, and they still haven't published their regulations, so this is still what we're trying to negotiate too. But so there's that initial permitting fee, and then there's going to be the annual fee. So between the two, I mean, there's some families that just don't have expendable income beyond what they already have that will lose their homes. And then there's some homes that just won't be able to come up to compliance. There are homes that are abandoned and that they haven't been paying their mooring fees, and they're kind of just off to the side. So those need to go. We agree with that. I mean, they have pictures of them, but there are many families that this will affect.
Okay. My paper here says 360 to 550 families. That's a lot of people.
Correct.
It's almost like a village. I have a lot of villages that aren't that big in my district. Kind of big stuff. Could you just give me in general how you feel that impacts the sense of community that you have over there?
Yeah. The community on the lakes are, I guess, of a time past. I, being from Minnesota, had a condo in northeast Minneapolis, and I couldn't even tell you the names of my neighbors. But on Fontana, I mean, everyone, you just get to know your neighbors. I don't know some of them yet because I haven't been to their houses. But, you know, like our neighbors lent us eggs. I was making meatloaf, and they had chickens. And, like, you know, being a city girl, it's like, wow, it's just... We even had a group of fishermen come up to our boat, and they needed a tool, and we happened to have it, and it was just me and my baby at that time, so I was kind of a little leery because they had a gun on their boat, but they just needed help. I gave them the help, I gave them the tool, and they fixed it, and it is a really strong sense of community, and this event has actually brought a lot of people together, so that's one good thing, meeting other people from other lakes, and then meeting people on our own lakes that would have taken a while from different marinas.
Oh, neat stuff. I'll ask Mr. Monteith a question as well. It's been your name different on my sheet than on your thing, but I guess Monteith is the thing. Okay, in your testimony, or in his testimony, TVA President William Johnson testified that, quote, TVA believes giving compliant homeowners until 2046 to continue enjoying their homes during the extensive sunset period helps mitigate the impact on floating homeowners. As an affected homeowner, what do you feel about that statement?
It is, it is devastating to the homeowner because, you know, hypothetically, just say you own a home and you're wanting to sell that home and nobody's wanting to buy that home as you get older because it's going to have to come off. What is that homeowner going to do as he's up 60, 70, maybe 80 years old in their family and they want to get rid of that home and they can't afford to? You know what's going to happen to that home? Lightning is going to mysteriously hit that home and it's going to burn and sink in the bottom of Fontana Lake and float all over the place. What are they going to do? Who are they going to sue? A dead man? I mean, get serious and not do something like this. It don't even make sense. That's what's going to happen to them. I mean, I'm just telling you. I mean, you know. Let me come back and add a statement if I can.
Sure, absolutely. They said I should ask you questions. I said they're right.
In the 50s and the 60s, TVA had houseboats all over Fontana Lake. They were not on what we call the state side, tied up in harbors. They were on Hazel Creek, Eagle Creek, Forney Creek, Chambers Creek, tied up all over the lake. What did the National Park Service and TVA do? They got together and made them take them all off and take them all into harbors. And, you know, people complied with that because they said it's better to put them in harbors. The dock owners can take care of them. And they're not scattered all over the lake to mess up the fishermen. And everybody was happy with that. And it's been working. And it works. And it's, again, what I said, limited how many you can put in that, on that lake. Because you can only put, if you own a harbor, you can only put so many. The only way you can put another is somebody's got to take it off, sell it, or do whatever. And occasionally that happens, and somebody new will put a new one in. But most times they just do like Miss Sneed. They just buy one and remodel it, and that's what they do.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Mr. Meadows for holding this. I got to go back to my other subcommittee, but keep your thumb on him.
I think the gentleman, we're going to go into a second round and actually, but I'll be very brief in light of my good friend from Virginia. I do want to clear up a few things as we look at this. One, Mr. Monteith, the proposals that you put forth to clean the lakes up in North Carolina that is being used, would you say that it's been effective?
Very effective. Very, very.
Would you see any barriers to allowing that to be used as a model for the other 48 reservoirs other than Fontana? Any barriers?
I think it should be used as a model.
All right. Mr. Johnson, do you see any barriers to being able to use that in any of your other 48 reservoirs?
Just the execution and enforcement, but the idea and the standards are good.
All right. So if a county of jurisdiction was willing to handle the enforcement of that policy, as Graham and Swain County have both agreed to do on Fontana and in our area, if a county was willing to take on that responsibility from TVA, do you not see that as a reasonable compromise? Because you have a government entity willing to enforce regulations for the health, safety, and welfare of the public, which they have as a primary responsibility already. Do you not see that that is something that TVA could actually transfer to the local governments within the counties to maintain and protect?
I'll have to say a theoretical yes to that. I really hadn't thought about that hard, but
Well, I suggested that originally. I said, you know, if I've got Graham and Swain County willing to take on the responsibility, let me just, Mr. Johnson, let me be clear. They already do.
yeah.
They already do. So how many game wardens do you have on your lakes and reservoirs?
We don't have game wardens.
Okay. How many law enforcement officers do you have on Fontana?
Depending time to time, a couple.
When was the last time they were on Fontana?
I've not saw them.
Ms. Monteith, have you seen?
Not saw them in years.
In years. So are they just sleeping under a tree, or are they going to some other reservoir?
They're no longer in uniform, so you might not be able to see them.
Oh, so we got undercover law enforcement officers.
They're not
How does that
undercover.
work?
They're not undercover. They just don't wear police uniforms.
So how many
They
citations have they given on Fontana?
don't, I don't know, but they don't write health citations. These are
So what do they do?
protect property. These are
How do
federal-
they do that without writing citations?
I just said they don't write health citations.
So how many citations have your law enforcement guys written on Fontana in the last 4 years since you've been there?
I do not know, but we can find out.
Well, you've got a staff. How many? You got your chief of staff behind you. I'm sure he knows. You can turn around and ask him. I'll give you time.
You've dealt with him. I'm pretty sure he doesn't know.
He doesn't know.
No, he won't know.
Oh, he won't know.
No.
Are you telling him not to know? Or
No,
you-
oh, no, I don't have to
okay.
tell him that.
Okay.
He legitimately doesn't know.
So since Ms. Sneed was worried about guns.
I hope you understand how that just came across.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, if I said that to my chief of staff, he'd fire me.
Yeah.
Don't ask him, he don't know.
So, Mr. Johnson, let me ask you this: what kind of firearms do they carry?
9mm Glocks
Okay.
and
not-
carbines in their vehicles.
All right. And so they use those, so they don't write citations, they just use their firearms?
They never use their firearms.
So they just,
I'm aware of no discharges of a weapon by a TVA policeman in my
okay,
time there.
I think you're getting my point.
Yes.
My point is the county not better suited to manage the health, safety, and welfare of the reservoirs that are within their jurisdiction than you are?
Well, and certainly I should say this, in most of our property, the primary law enforcement is the local sheriff.
I know that. I
right?
talked to Sheriff Cochran on
Right,
Swain
so-
County. He's
yeah.
already told me that. And so
yeah.
is it not a reasonable request that we do this for the benefit of the floating homeowners? Or do you have such a burr in your saddle that you want to get rid of them, no matter what, that a reasonable compromise is not something that you're willing to look at?
No, first of all, to the first question, is this a good idea to have local enforcement? I think I said yes to that. I would like to ponder the exact execution, but yes. I do think putting in standards, all those things is good. And the TVA board especially thinks this idea of permanence is just something they cannot do.
But they got that recommendation from staff.
Well, they got a whole bunch of recommendations in the EI.
So have they heard from more people that are in favor of floating homes or against floating homes?
They've heard in the public listening sessions, they've heard from more people who are in favor of floating homes. Survey
And in
comment,
terms of the complaints and petitions, have they heard from more people that are in favor of floating homes or against it?
actually, in the comment period in the EIS and the comment period in the land policy, we heard from many, many more who are opposed to any residential
Well, that's because you
development.
got your good friend, Mr. Butler from the Federation, that sends out a mass email to all of their activists that say that, or are they actually local constituents?
They're all people who live in the Tennessee Valley.
All right, and so what you're saying is you got more responses from that.
Yeah.
But yet, I asked you a question about how many complaints you had originally. You couldn't answer that, but you know for a fact your sworn testimony is this.
Right. So, yeah, I don't know exactly how many complaints we have. I do know when we do surveys, when we do EIS, when we do land policy, much stronger opposition to any residential development on or around the water than support for it.
All right, so let me ask you this. What's your primary responsibility and main mission at TVA? What's the primary? The number one thing, if I'm asking you the number one thing, what would it be?
I say we follow the statute. There are 3 priorities in the statute.
Of which managing natural resources is not one of those. I've looked, and I would challenge you to give that statute to me. If you go to tva.gov right now,
Yep.
you can look at what your statutes are. Environmental is at the very last part of it. What is the number one?
Probably the number 1 is low-cost, reliable electricity. which funds the
Exactly.
rest
And
of
why
it.
is that? Because in the TVA Act, didn't it kind of stipulate that the CEO had to have some kind of utility background?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, and so that's your number one priority focus. So why are we spending so much time on floating homes if that's your number one? Are you making a profit?
No, we make no profit.
Yeah.
We make no profit.
So how much do you get paid?
About $4.5 million a year.
All right. With bonuses and other things, what's your total compensation?
About 4.5.
All right, so $4.5 million
Yep.
to make no money.
To make,
Are you losing money?
no. No, we're actually in very good financial shape. The co-chairman said the debt is high. Actually,
How
we
many
brought the
billions
debt-
of dollars of unfunded liabilities do you have for retirement?
Somewhere in the neighborhood of $6 billion.
So how can you say that you have $6 billion in unfunded liabilities for retirement and that you're in good financial shape?
We've taken the debt down $1 billion in the last.
I didn't
couple
say
years.
the progress. I'm saying how could you say that?
Well, because we are in good financial shape. We're
Well,
top
only
credit rating.
because you have what? What, could you sell your company if you didn't have the backing of the federal government? So if you didn't have a $500 million credit line that just got renewed 2 weeks ago, or a $1.6 billion credit line from the federal government, could you sell your corporation to a private entity?
We couldn't, but you could. But
Assuming that President Obama and I agree that that would be a good idea, because as you know, you pointed it out to me that he wants to do that. So assuming that we both agree that that's a good idea, would somebody buy it?
sure. The
Without-
administration
with the
no
current
longer
liability.
thinks it's a good. Sure, every entity has unfunded liabilities that go well into the future. Ours is no different than anybody else's. And if you look at our financial
Well, it
structure.
is different. I have looked at your financials, Mr. Johnson. You know that I have.
Sure.
So tell me about this nuclear plant that you've invested $5 billion, and you now have an offer, I guess, of what, $38 million?
We don't have an offer, we have a minimum bid price.
Minimum bid price.
Yeah,
So
so
you
this-
have no offers on it at this point?
The period to receive offers hasn't ended yet, so.
All right, so you've invested $5 billion, and you're wanting $38 million for it.
So, a little history, that plant was started in
Don't need the history. I
1974.
know the history. I understand it started before your time. I don't need that. Let me just, I'm trying to show that what you got here is you're focusing on 1,826 floating homes when you should be focusing on something else.
I'll tell you, I'm entirely focused on running TVA, and if you actually look at the record and look at the last couple of years, you're going to see tremendous improvement. I will put our performance up against any utilities in the country. We have reduced our debt, we have reduced our spending by 25%.
You know, I'm an old utility guy, and I understand that. I understand where you were, I understand where you are, and as I look at that, in embarking on selling off this asset that you have $5 billion invested in, and you're going to sell it off, what's your return on investment?
There is none. If you,
Exactly. All right. So who is Scott Fiedler? Is it Fiedler or Fiedler? You know him?
I don't.
Who's your spokesperson?
Well, we have a bunch of them.
Well, I've got a quote here from a Scott Fiedler.
Could be. We have,
Does he work for you?
if he's a spokesperson for us, he does. We have a lot of spokespeople.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he speaks for TVA.
If he's one of ours, yes.
Well, turn around and ask him if he's one of yours.
Is he one of ours?
Okay.
He's
All
one of
right.
ours.
I'm glad your chief of staff knows something. All right. So, as
Thank God.
So let me ask you. Here's what's concerning me. Here's a quote from your spokesperson, and it has to do with the $5 billion nuclear power plant that you're selling off there. That has what, 1,600 acres along the river. Is that correct?
Yes.
1,600 acres along the river.
Yep.
TVA says it isn't particularly concerned about what the purchaser does using the site for power production or industrial manufacturing or recreation or even residential. It's not particularly concerned about it. How do you reconcile not particularly concerned about what happens with 1,600 acres along a river with being very concerned with what happens with 1,826 floating homes on 49 reservoirs?
So
How do you reconcile the two?
Yeah, so actually the sale of that property, which will be done at open bid, has a buffer along the river. The property along the river is not going to be sold
All right, so
to avoid this very problem.
all right, so what you're saying is that you're not going to let them do anything with the river.
Right. We're keeping a buffer.
But they can do all kinds of manufacturing there, right?
Sure. We hope they
So
will.
in terms of the environment, are you going to put restrictions on that?
There are restrictions on that as a matter of federal and state law. We will enforce
Okay,
them.
that's exactly my point.
Yeah.
There are restrictions on the waters of every single reservoir you have that are federal and state laws. Why do we need you?
Well, we have a different reading of the statute, but as I read the statute, we are responsible for the Tennessee River and its tributaries.
So, your spokesman went on to say that really his primary goal was just to sell the property.
We are holding.
So was that accurate?
Yeah, well, what we're trying to do is to put it to productive use, since we are never going to build that plant and never going to need the power from it. So if there's a way to return it to productive use, that would be a good idea.
All right. Have you lobbied members of Congress and senators up here as it relates to floating homes?
No, we do not lobby.
Okay. Have you had meetings with senators and congressmen as it relates to floating homes, other than me?
I'm unaware of any. I think we've answered some questions from various offices. But that's, I think, the extent.
And so your sworn testimony here today is that you did not initiate any contact with any other member of Congress other than myself. Is that your sworn testimony?
My testimony.
I would suggest you check with your
Well,
government affairs folks.
I'm about to. My testimony was, I have not.
Okay.
So, I mean-
I'm assuming that it's not you. So has anyone done that?
We've had conversations, but I don't think we certainly haven't lobbied on it.
Well, that's just a definition of lobby. I mean, conversations are lobbying. I mean, I'm not saying you are federally a lobbyist,
Right.
but you've initiated responses, right?
Well, my chief of staff says we haven't, and I certainly don't know of any. But we have been asked questions, obviously, by members of the delegation.
Sure. And so the members of the delegation, are they supportive of your new policy?
Some are not, and some are not involved.
All
I
right,
haven't-
so
I
there's
haven't
no
heard-
one who is supportive. There's some who are saying they're not going to take a position, but the others are against it.
I think that's fair, yeah.
All right, so you don't care what members of Congress or senators really have to say about this, is that correct?
No, that's not correct at all. I do care.
Well, you're saying that everybody's against it.
Yeah, the difference is I think you all are engaged in serving your constituents as you should. I think we're on a little different mission here, which is public resource stewardship.
Okay, here's what I would like for you to get back to this committee. In the priority of public resource stewardship, give me the statutes which puts that at the same priority as the rest of it. Now, on anything on TVA.gov, does it give you the ability to revoke these permits?
I think when the permits were issued, they said there's no property right created here. So
Anything on TVA.gov?
I don't think there's a specific revocation.
I can tell you, there's not. I've read every single word, and there's not anything, not one mention of revoking anything. In fact, just the opposite. It says if you get a permit, you got a permit. Now, in the 26A application permit, I've looked at that. You got some language there. But in terms of notice to the public, there is nothing on your website even today that would suggest you can do what you're doing. In fact, it says that we're going to grandfather everybody in from 1978 before.
Correct.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, correct.
All right. So you're going to get some of these things back. We've got a number of questions that are there. I'm going to let the gentleman go. Here is my request of all of you. You've been writing notes. You've got that. And here's what I would ask you to do, and those that are watching via webcast. If there's questions that you have that weren't asked, submit them to the committee. We'll be glad to ask those questions. Mr. Johnson, I want to make it very clear. I am very concerned that with the public outcry that I'm hearing, that other members of Congress are hearing, that you've seen, that this was an arbitrary decision that was not based solely on the number one priority that you have, to produce low-cost energy for the region, to create jobs. If anything, this is a jobs killer. And what you've done is you've taken one priority to make it higher than the other. And I'm discouraged that Mr. Monteith has given you a solution, and your board is not even willing to look at that, to use that. It seems to me to be very poor decision-making when you have a solution that would address it right here. You have a solution. And your testimony says that Fontana's doing well, right?
Yeah, I think I said this, that part of the solution is good. It doesn't address the other issue of permanent property rights in public resources.
And so what in statute gives you the ability to control that?
So we lean on 26A in the statute. We have some other things. We will get you all those statutory references. But, you know, we do a lot of stewardship things. We're Native American remains repatriation.
Well, it's funny
All
you
these
mention that, because I know that, and actually, I think you had promised some support for the Eastern Band, that you would get them some support for a piece of land in Tennessee, and yet you haven't really followed up on that, Mr. Johnson.
I think
No, they don't have the letter. I checked this morning.
well, I will check when I get back to
So you'll get them the letter?
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
I would just, if I could parenthetically, Mr. Chairman, I'm with you all the way, Mr. Johnson, on the assertion that nobody has any permanent squatting rights on public land. I'm sorry, you don't. And anyone who asserts otherwise is wrong, and the implications of conceding that across the country, I mean, so what? I get to build my dream house on the rim of the Grand Canyon or in the middle of Yellowstone? I mean, where does that end? Public land is public land. However, so let us stipulate that, and let's assert it properly. But meanwhile, we've got a human problem with 1,826 homes. Can we work out a solution, I think the chairman is suggesting, stipulating your principle without unnecessarily discommoding and harming those individuals who are there? They're here now. Is the only solution to make the point about, no, you cannot exercise that right on public land, we have to evict you. You all have to go away by X period in history. And I think that's really the question here.
Sure, I agree.
And I share the chairman's frustration that there has to be some kind of middle way that allows us to, you know, assert that principle while also not harming innocent people who are trying to be right with the law. Now, if they're operating illegally, that's a different matter. And Mr. Monteith, I know you would share that, as you're sworn to uphold the law, as am I, as is the chairman. And in local government, that's what we have to do, right? But we also exercise common judgment while we're doing it. And that's really, I think, the challenge here. So no one, I think, would take issue with your assertion. But on the other hand, we got a lot of Miss Sneeds here who, in good faith, have chosen a lifestyle and a place to live, to raise their families, and don't want to be evicted arbitrarily. And so we got to find a middle way to make both work.
If I can make one point here, and I agree with that, and this is hard. It was not arbitrary and capricious. It was hard thought. It took a long time. At the end of the sunset period, the youngest floating house I got a permit will be 70 years old, and the oldest will be 100. And so I don't know what the period is that you can exert occupancy and some right, but 70 years is a pretty long time. So it's not just 30 years. It's, remember, those permits were issued in 1970.
I assure you, it's not as long as
Yeah,
you
I was
may
going to
think.
say,
I'm
it gets
starting to
younger
agree
every
with that,
day.
yeah.
All right. If I want to thank all the witnesses, and I'm looking forward to the follow-up. I'm looking forward to resolving this in a way that doesn't harm the families that are here, doesn't harm the economy that we see. And we didn't put a lot of emphasis on this, but I can tell you there are marina owners, there are people that truly make their living. And Mr. Johnson, since you've been there, you know Graham and Swain County have been in the depression for a long time. And so when we look at that, when we talk about jobs, we're talking about, some of the folks that honestly in Graham County, the population doesn't grow because there's no new jobs, and you're about to take some away. And when that happens in my backyard, let me tell you, what you've experienced today is just the beginning. Because and I've told you that personally, and you know that, and it's not a threat. I've got to stand up for the people that I represent. And I don't own a floating home. Don't plan to own a floating home. They'll get real cheap, as it gets closer, so I could probably buy a half dozen of them. So, as we look at that, I guess y'all are going to compensate all these floating home owners because you didn't enforce your own regulations. So when you do that, you're going to actually compensate them, right?
I doubt that that's the case.
Yeah, I doubt it too. Well, if there's no further business before the committee stands adjourned.